All right, so
Okay.
Bruchim Abayim, everybody. Thank you for your patience as we start a little bit, a few minutes later this time due to a bit of a technical challenge. So hopefully everybody has received, Mary and I sent it to you as well. Hopefully everybody has received an email with a document attached. My apologies for not providing a link that you could open it from the chat box, but if you have an opportunity to print it, that would be great. It's only 2.5 pages, or you can just read it on your screen. That would be great. So in a moment, I'm going to come back to that document and we'll discuss why I've sent that to you. So first of all, we're considering Parshat Truma today, and I want to open it with a question to you. Before you read, don't start reading. Be obedient and don't start reading it yet in anticipation. I know everybody, like good students, you want to get ahead of everyone and have a heads up on what we're going to be talking about, but you'll have time to get to it. As I said, it's not that long. The initial question I would ask you, if you were to consider Parshat Truma, you know that it goes into great detail and at great length in describing the instructions about what is supposed to be brought, what types of items are acceptable as volunteer contributions, donations to build and prepare the Mishkan and all the various accessories. Only instructions, of course. We'll read later on about the actual construction of it. That's a whole other story in itself. But the great detail that's there really gives us perhaps a moment to think about what is the focus of this thing we call the Mishkan, the temporary sanctuary. Later on, to be developed into a temple and various versions of a temple. But what would you say is the most important verse or element in this week's Parsha about Truma? Is there something that you could identify, without necessarily reading the Parsha? What about this Parsha would you say is most important? Anyone want to take a stab at that? From whatever you recall, I don't expect you to know verses off by heart or anything, but from what you recall of this Parsha Truma, even from its title. Go ahead, Barb.
At the end, I thought I was taken by the fact that the menorah was mentioned for the very first time.
Okay, so the menorah, which becomes a very significant element in the Mishkan and temples, but also becomes one of the symbols of the state of Israel today.
Right.
So a very powerful symbol, the menorah. Good, so that's mentioned, definitely. Okay, that sounds like a legitimate choice. Anyone else? That's fine. You can keep that question open and consider that as we discuss. So what struck me most about the Parsha is a very short verse that we read this morning, and it's in the first section of the Parsha. It says that God says, God's giving these instructions to Moshe to convey to the people of Israel and all those who are going to be bringing various donations and offerings. God says, "Ve'asu li mikdash v'shachanti v'tocham." Build me a sanctuary so that, and I will dwell among them. Very powerful statement, this idea that something needs to be built to house God. There are many questions that arise. Why does God need to be housed? Can God be housed? And one of the most compelling discussions I've found about this whole idea of God and God's presence or absence in the world and the relationship with humanity, let alone the people of Israel, is this beautiful drasha written by Rabbi Shai Help, who's currently a very significant part of the Hadar Institute. And I didn't present to you the entire drasha, but the part that deals with what does this mean about God dwelling among us, and where does that idea come from, and how should we view it today in terms of our understanding of the relationship with God? So what I would ask you to do, again, it's 2.5 pages, it's not that long. I want you to read that article, and then we're going to try to discuss that and see what your take is on what Rabbi Held has to say. So I'll just ask, does everybody have access to that article, or do I need to share screen? Is there anyone who does not have access to that article? Marion, you weren't able to get it on your email? I sent an email with an attachment. I'll put it on the screen. It may be a little small, so I may have to make it a little bit larger and then move it according to reading pace. Okay, I'll put it on my screen. In any case, those of you who have access to it, either printed or on their screen, I'd ask you to read those 2.5 pages, take a few minutes, obviously, and then we'll get back together and discuss it. In the meantime, I'm going to share it on my screen for those of you who aren't able to access it through your computer. So those who are looking at my screen, and if you have your own, don't bother. Can you read it on the screen, or is it too small?
It's too small.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it a little bit larger, and then I'll move it around slowly, giving you a chance to read it, okay?
Okay.
Is that large enough, Marion?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah,
That's
thank
better?
you.
Okay, so let's try that, and I'll move the pages accordingly. I'll just kind of take my time.
Question.
There, that's the first page. Good, so you have that now. So just let me know when you're ready to go to the next page, Marianne.
Yeah, I'm on the right side now.
Okay, so I'll bring it down and then,
Okay, thank you.
there we go.
You can move page 2 up. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Every
Ready to go to the next page, Marianne?
yeah. It's very interesting. Everything. very interesting.
Okay, Marianne, have you had a chance to finish it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So hopefully those of you who are reading it on the share, I'm going to close that for a moment. Okay, has everyone gotten through the article more or less? You don't have to write a term paper on it, don't worry. So if you missed a few of the elements, that's fine. I just wanted you to get some kind of a gist. So I found this drashah probably one of the better drashot I've read on how our relationship with God might be viewed. So what I'd like to do is, before I offer some of my thoughts, I'd like to offer you guys the opportunity to express maybe something about what you understood from that article about how we might view our relationship with God, and perhaps somewhat differently than the way that many of us consider it, based on both the Kabbalistic, Lurianic view, as well as the later or earlier rabbinic view, this idea of tzimtzum. What is limiting, what is restraining ourselves in terms of how present we are? What's the significance of that? Initially, let's just talk about the relationship with God. So it's a rather daunting task to try to talk about that, but who's willing to give it a shot? Marianne, go ahead.
Well, I think it's God, we're in and out. We're in and out. When God wants us to be in a sanctuary together, that's why they built one. But he wants us to be self-sufficient so that we can think. I think that's what they're trying to say. He wants us to think for ourselves, but be available if we're needed, if he's needed. And I think there's a power there, a very strong power of pull and restrain, pull and restrain.
Okay, I think that's a fascinating take on it. And again, whatever your interpretation of this is, that's what's relevant. Rabbi Held has a certain understanding of these views about the idea of tzimtzum, limitation, etc., contraction, however we define or translate that. But I think what you said is another element, this idea that it's a process where the reality of it is different. Sometimes there is that connection. Sometimes God may be present. Sometimes God may not be present. Meaning the relationship between us and God is not a constant. If I understood you correctly, Marianne.
Yes.
When God is needed or when we are needed. I think that's a beautiful mutuality that Rabbi Hill talks about as well. But this idea that it's not a constant thing, it's not always the same, it's not static. There is movement in our relationship with God. It's not something that is there and has been there since the creation of the earth or the appearance of humanity through Adam and Eve, however we view that, or since the beginnings of the Jewish people. There is a change in the relationship. It's an ongoing processional one between us and the divine. Okay, anyone else? Go ahead, Lynn. Just unmute yourself first.
To me, it was partial explanation of the concept of free will. That we have free will. We can make our own choices.
And that is incredibly powerful as well. I was reading a fascinating book about a comparison between the Bible and the Quran, and the various views, the different views that traditional Islam and traditional Judaism have of God, God's power, God's presence. There's certain similarities, but there's some very dramatic differences. And this idea about free will, whether we submit to the will of God or whether we do in fact have free will to make those choices, if that's what God seeks in God's relationship with us, to make sure that we have the ability through offering us space, as Rabbi Held says, in order to express that free will. So that's a certainly very powerful element of this relationship. Okay, anyone else? Barbara, go ahead.
I was actually going to say something similar to what Lynn just said, and that was that I appreciated not having the imposition of God being placed upon us, but we are able to make some decisions for ourselves.
Okay, that's a good. Let me ask you then. So, when you say we are able to make some decisions for ourselves, where are we not able to make decisions for ourselves? If you had something like that in mind, there's a limitation on our free will. Is it an absolute free will? What are the limits to our free will?
Sometimes there are external circumstances that impose situations on us, and we really don't have any ability to change them or alter them. And so we would probably turn to God or rely on God for some support and some spiritual guidance. And then there are other situations where we do have the control to arrange our lives.
Okay. I think that some would say that regardless of force majeure or external factors which determine what is going to happen, that may not, and I'm just suggesting this, that may not, and this is a discussion in itself, of course, this whole idea of predetermination or free will and to what extent we have it. I don't think that the fact that factors beyond our control determine what's going to happen to us take away our free will. Free will, in my understanding, and I don't think Rabbi Held goes into this to any great extent, at least in this drasha, doesn't necessarily mean that we have control of everything that's going to happen to us, but we have the choice to determine how we're going to respond to situations. It may be to no effect. It may be that whatever we do, we choose to do, we can't prevent things from happening. To take it to an extreme case, you may be in a situation, and God forbid any of us should ever be in that situation. You're being tortured. You are commanded or instructed or requested to offer information. So, in a sense, you may not be able to determine what's going to happen to you through that process, unfortunately. You have the determination to decide whether you are going to offer that information. If you're able to endure, withstand whatever torture you go through, you still have free will. And you might say, well, my body is dictating what I'm going to do. I don't have free will anymore. You always have free will. You always have the choice to determine if you're willing to endure the consequences of that. But again, that's perhaps a more complicated question. So this idea that free will is something very powerful here in Rabbi Held's suggestion, based on his understanding of Tzimtzum in both cases, that in order for us to express that free will, God has to give us some room. We can't have free will if God is in fact omnipresent to the point of drowning us, you might say, in God's presence. If God is everywhere and God is within us, then how can we say that we have free will? If God entails everything in the world, then perhaps that free will is somewhat limited, if existent at all. And so this idea that God removes God's self from a certain part of the world, either from our own being or existence or from our world, according to the Lurianic interpretation, that allows for us to be able to express and execute our free will to the best of our ability and to whatever extent we're willing to choose to do so. Anyone else have any takes on what you read here?
Michael,
Yes.
Well, I think that our relationship with God, I think, is it's up to us. And when we talk about free will, it's whenever we choose to have that relationship, and that depends on whatever situation we are in. You know, but I think that it's up to us to have that relationship whenever we need it.
Okay, so this idea that it's there for the taking, and God, at least according to this interpretation, God is allowing the potential for a relationship by giving us enough space to explore the possibility of that relationship. This traditional view of God being perhaps potentially overwhelming and omnipotent as well as omnipresent, meaning always there, everywhere, and all powerful. These ideas say that God is willing, if we can attribute that to God, God is willing to choose to be less than God might normally or potentially be in order to allow the creation of humanity and the world to exist in a meaningful way and to have that relationship with God. It's not enough to create something and then completely dominate it and overwhelm it. If you want to have a relationship with that being or that existence, according to these interpretations, you have to make sure you give that existence some kind of space, should it be chosen to explore a relationship, as you suggest, Rosalie. Yeah,
Well,
go
but I
ahead.
think that God has a relationship with everyone, but it's up to us to know whether we're going to reciprocate that relationship, and that depends on if we want to, depends on our situation. Sometimes we need to have that relationship. Maybe we always have that relationship is there, always, but it's how we execute, I guess, and the need that relationship depending on how situations arise.
Okay, and I think the way we were discussing that relationship can be rather alien or foreign to a lot of people who view God in more traditional ways, because we're talking about some kind of a mutuality in relationship, and the moment we've talked about that might perhaps in itself, that definition, that expression of a mutuality in a relationship with the divine might, in a sense, somewhat limit the divine, meaning that our understanding of a potential relationship, some saying, limits God at the same time, perhaps, that God is limiting God. Our understanding of being able to say that we can have something in common with God in terms of relationship either puts us higher up in some kind of divine aspect or brings God down to earth to have some kind of more human aspect. And if we consider, and this would be a fascinating exploration when we consider how the differences between how Christianity, Islam, and Judaism view relationship with God, this idea of it's the idea of relationship that perhaps is the most significant. Can we approach God, or can we only submit to God's will because of that vast difference in our existence? Is there a potential relationship that's there, should we choose it, as you suggest, depending on our understanding of God and God's willingness to go through some kind of contraction or limitation of God's presence? Or does God become present, not just in some virtual way in a mikdash, but does God become present among humanity in the form of flesh, as Christianity, traditional Christian theology and doctrine believe? This idea of the Word becoming flesh, of God taking on some kind of human form through Jesus. So this idea of relationship with God is basic to those three religions, to Islam, to Judaism, and to Christianity, and perhaps trying to understand the nature of that relationship in each gives us a little bit of insight as to what each of those religions bases its understanding of God on. Let's come back to Judaism for a moment. I just want to read something towards the end that was part of what I offered you. It says on the third page, a real divine human relationship depends upon God making space for humanity. And along the lines of what some of you said, in order to summon us as partners, and this is key, the idea of partnership with God, because when we talk about partners, we talk about there being a mutuality. Those partners can't be vastly different in their existence if there's going to be a true partnership. Otherwise, it becomes simply a dominating partner and a submissive partner. And I don't think that's the kind of relationship we're trying to understand when we come to how we view God. So in order to summon us as partners, God needs to affirm and respect our independence. A phenomenally fascinating anthropomorphic view. God has to accept our independence. God needs to affirm and respect our independence, perhaps just as we need to affirm and respect God's power and God's presence everywhere. And the last line that I suggested to you was Jewish theology insists that God wants relationship, and the possibility of relationship emerges only when both partners are honored in their separateness and then choose to come together. So this idea of there being a process in a relation in the relationship development, first there has to be that recognition, and you can only do that if you're separate from that person with whom you want to establish a relationship, and then you can come together. The part I didn't give you about his article, and I would suggest if you can access that, I'll be happy to send that to you, I suppose. The Rabbi Held, and this is what I want to talk about, at least for a few minutes, Rabbi Held then goes to talk about, well, if that's the way we view our relationship with God, or at least the divine human relationship, how can we view human relationships between humans? Can we take some kind of understanding of that and translate that into interhuman relationships and interaction? So we start off with this idea that in order for there to be a true, meaningful, and mutuality in the relationship, there has to be a recognition of separateness, of individuality, before you choose to come together. And Rabbi Held mentions Martin Buber. You're all probably familiar with Martin Buber's work called I and Thou, the beginning of relationships. And in that work, Buber writes, in the beginning is relation. That's what he first believed. He felt that before anything else, there's a relationship among human beings. But then, in his later writings, as Rabbi Held says, Buber emphasizes that in order for genuine relation to be possible, something else has to happen first. And what is that? It begins with what he calls the primal setting at a distance, and then continues with entering into relation. So this idea that before there can be a relationship of any meaning, you have to acknowledge that the other exists, that the other is different from you. You may have things in common, but that other has an individuality, has an identity that has to be acknowledged and recognized. And only when you have that separateness, that observation at a distance where you can appreciate, because you're far enough away to see someone, a potential partner, or someone with whom you potentially want to enter into a relationship, you have to be able to see them in their wholeness, in their totality. And you can only do that if you're sufficiently distant from something. We often talk about that in order to appreciate a place where we live, whether it be a city or within a family. If you're completely within that, just think about your home. If you're in a room in your house, you can appreciate that room. You can't appreciate the whole house because you don't see the whole house. Sometimes you need to be sufficiently far in order to see something or someone in totality. Same thing with an individual. If you're up close to somebody and only involved with them perhaps in a certain element, that's all you know about them. You sometimes need to take a step back in order to appreciate everything about an individual. I'll give you an example. If you work with somebody, you may work with them 6-8 hours a day and 40 hours a week. That's what you see of them. If you're not able to step back and see them in their personal life, in their volunteer life, in their religious life, outside of the workspace, then you can't, or you haven't acknowledged everything about that person you need or should want to know in order to make your relationship with them as meaningful as possible. Do we do that all the time? Of course not. we have very compartmentalized and defined relationships based on where we encounter an individual. But according to Buber and according to this understanding that Rabbi Held is providing of us, if we want to have the most meaningful and potentially significant relationship possible with an individual, we have to be able to step back and accept and acknowledge everything about that individual, including the warts, so to speak, including those things with which we don't identify and don't agree with. And that when I talk about knowing an individual, it's not just their activity, it's what they think about, what they believe. We may come across things that we don't accept and we don't agree with them. And that's part of a meaningful relationship, understanding those elements that we don't identify with and that we don't agree with, because that's as much a part of their identity as those things that we do agree with. And so this beautiful idea that Buber came to appreciate perhaps later in life, and that maybe the Lurianic and later rabbinic understandings of Tzimtzum with God and humanity suggest that we need to be able to step away and see and acknowledge someone before we enter into a meaningful relationship. And once we're able to do that, then we can come together and find those things that we can enjoy that are similar and respect and appreciate those things where we differ. That's the nature of the most potentially significant relationship possible. And when we talk about a relationship, it doesn't mean that it's all fun and enjoyment. A relationship is not necessarily a good thing in terms of our emotional well-being. It can be a very troubling thing, a very challenging thing. But that's what relationship means, accepting the totality of the potential of that relationship. And it brings me to something, I spoke very briefly this morning about relationships between, within the Jewish people. I showed a picture of the snow in Jerusalem that fell yesterday, and I had a picture of a Muslim woman on the Temple Mount and a man in the prayer shawl and a talit praying at the Western Wall. And somebody wrote to me in the chat box this morning when I showed those pictures that it's very ironic when we're talking about trying to understand our relationship with God and with the land of Israel, even at a place like the Western Wall, which has assumed great significance for us. Even the Jewish people can't agree on that, because as we're well aware of something that happened last week and has happened for years, the challenge of women who want to create the wall and share that space, a holy space. And the idea of a holy space, especially when we talk about a place where God like to be present in order to help us establish a relationship with God, there isn't agreement among the Jewish people today what that holy space might mean. But just to get back to this idea of setting a distance in order to appreciate an individual and then entering into a relationship, it also translates into how we deal with other nations. For example, without getting overly political, we talk about a two-state solution or a one-state solution in terms of Israel and the Palestinians. And I would say, based on my understanding of what Rabbi Held has to say and what Buber says, we've been involved with the Palestinians at such a close distance for so long that we no longer have the ability to develop some kind of relationship that's going to be sufficiently significant and sustainable. And when we talk about a one-state solution, for that reason, I think a one-state solution is not practical. We need to be at a distance. When there is sufficient difference between peoples, then we need to be able to step back, assess, observe, recognize, and acknowledge that that other group has a different identity. Then we can enter into a relationship with them. But a relationship doesn't mean that we have to be living together in one state. We need to perhaps maintain a certain separateness in order to maintain some kind of sustainable relationship because of the differences. And that can happen between individuals as well. sometimes you need to maintain a certain distance with someone in order for that relationship to be workable and not get too close. And I'm sure many of you have perhaps personal experience on how that works and how that doesn't work. So I think what Rabbi Held is suggesting through the inspiration of Yitzhak Lurie and other rabbinic understandings of our relationship with God is that if we want to develop and maintain any kind of relationship that's going to be meaningful and perhaps sustainable, not all relationships are sustainable, but if something's going to be meaningful to depth and significant, we have to be able to limit ourselves, limit our presence in order to allow the other person to exist at the same time. That can mean separating ourselves. It can mean restraining ourselves from overly expressing our opinion, from overly preferring what we think, what we believe, what we would like, and not allowing the other person in that relationship to do and think as they would like to do. And we all know of relationships where there is somebody who's incredibly dominant and somebody who's much less because one person doesn't allow the other person to have the space required. And so that if we're going to have any kind of mutual meaningful relationship with others, let alone with God, we have to make sure that we are present, we show what we're all about, but we allow the other person in that relationship to express and show what they're about as well. That's not something all of us are able to do on a regular basis. And often you might say, well, that's not our personalities. Any kind of relationship, the chance that two people in a relationship are going to be equally willing to be present in terms of expressing themselves and willing to restrain or let tzamtzem, to limit themselves in order to allow the other person sufficient space, doesn't always work on an equal basis, and because everybody is different. But we have to be aware of our obligation to both be present as well as to step back and allow the other person to be present as well. And of course, that discussion can go into other areas as well in terms of emotionally present, etc. But we'll leave it at this for the time being. I hope that exploring this a little bit has given you a little bit of thought to consider how we relate to God. But more importantly, and perhaps that's the point of this whole discussion, is how we relate to one another. God, our relationship with God should be a rather personal one. Our relationships with others is something that we are involved with and exposed to on a regular basis, and that needs to be something that we give appropriate thought and consideration to. So I'll allow anyone or encourage anyone who would like to share some thoughts or ask any questions, feel free to do so.
Michael?
Sure.
It's Rhoda.
Go ahead, Rhoda.
I missed all the preamble. Is there any way that I can retrieve it later?
So I sent you the article.
Oh, good.
I didn't want to put it up on the screen again because
No, of course.
I wanted to be able to see people's faces. But I've sent you the article, so you'll have available what everybody had read. It's just 2.5 pages from a Dvar Torah written by Rabbi Shai Held a number of years ago that has to do with Truma and our relationship with God and with other human beings. So hopefully I'll have a chance to take a look at that.
I certainly will. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that, Rhoda.
No, it's okay.
Good morning.
We
Go
worked
ahead,
it out.
Alan.
Yeah, in the last sentence, really on the last page, Jewish theology insists that God wants relationships, possibility, when both partners are honored in their separateness. God honored us years and years ago, gave us the Torah. We honor God 3 times a day. We recite the Amidah. Does anybody believe now that God honors us? A lot of people will say that God failed us big time in the 20th century.
Well, I'll allow others to respond. What I would say, and this is what how we often think about that as Rosalie suggested, God wants us to feel independent. God wants us to have the sense that we have the ability to make choices. So you might say that perhaps God might have been more insistent in expressing an opinion about how we're doing things and how we're allowing things to occur. But the bottom line is that we have the independence and the ability to make decisions for ourselves. If we choose, and as Rabbi Held says in a paragraph that I didn't give to you, I'll just read one thing that is of interest. If we, oh, just a second, I can't find it now. What was it? He says that if we choose not to be sensitive to others, if we choose to destroy things rather than create, if we can choose all those things, and if we choose it, then we're not exploring the relationship to the extent we should be. But that's still our choice. It's how we are going to interpret that relationship. We can be loving and nurturing, or we can be smothering and overwhelming. We can make Shabbat something beautiful, we can desecrate the Shabbat. It's our choice to find where on that spectrum of respecting and acknowledging the other, whether it be tradition, whether it be other individuals, whether it be God, that's something up to us. And what Rabbi Held is suggesting is that's the nature of our relationship with God. God is not going to overwhelm us when God thinks we're doing something wrong. Just as when a child of ours does something wrong, we try, not always successfully, we try to allow that child to learn on their own without preventing them. The famous thing about if a child is going to touch a stove or something, you might say, get the hand away, don't let that child do it. The other saying, well, let them feel the heat, maybe they need to be burned a little bit. That might be a bit of a harsh example, but we allow our children to somewhat learn on their own. We're not going to smother them with prevention, which will perhaps not allow them to learn through experience and be a lesson that is more sustainable and long-term than only saying no and preventing them from doing something. So you might say that relationship with God in a parent-child sense, that's one way we look at it. But I would say in any relationship, if you always suggest to somebody in a relationship, whether it be spousal, whether it be sibling, whether it be parent-child, if you always prevent them from doing something because you don't agree with it, that person will never appreciate your position because you're simply imposing on them. And I think this idea of relationship with God is where God does not impose God's self on humanity. God suggests to us something that might be constructive and effective in living our lives through the Torah, however broadly we define that. But it's our choice whether to accept that. And if it were imposed on us by saying, in the form of commandments, and that's why I don't like using that word, I prefer the word instruction. If it were a commandment where we have no choice but to obey it or suffer consequences, that's not the best teaching. And Torah means teaching. You have to be able to teach people to appreciate your suggestions, your instructions, if you want them to internalize that, if you want them to accept it, if you want them to explore it meaningfully as having something potentially relevant for them. That has to come with some kind of mutuality and respect for the other side, and let them make mistakes. Let them destroy themselves to a certain extent, I suppose. But that's their choice. If they can't appreciate what tolerance and inclusiveness and accepting the other is all about, well, then they're going to pay for it. Of course, most of us aren't willing to let that happen indefinitely. At some point, we will intervene and prevent things from going beyond a certain point. And you might say, well, why didn't God get to that point in World War II or whatever instance you choose? I would not dare answer that. Anyone else?
Ultimately, we all have a choice. In fact, the last sentence does end with that very clearly, doesn't it? It says we choose to come together. But God does tell Moses to tell the Israelites to bring gifts. The notion of bringing gifts, you usually bring gifts under your own volition. You're giving something. So he's teaching us to give, but you're still having a choice whether you give. It's not a commandment, is it? If it's a commandment, then the relationship is definitely skewed. But there has to be some willingness to say, okay, I hear what you're saying, and I want to be a part of that relationship, I suppose.
Yeah, and if you look at the verse, it says, "Made kosher asher nidvat libo," the generosity within their heart
No,
brings something
I got too many of them.
that perhaps the most effective way to suggest to people about donating and giving is not to command them, but to suggest to them, and it's no coincidence that in this instance, with regards to the Mishkan, it says quite clearly, more was brought than they could handle. People brought more than they needed, and Moshe had to tell them, stop bringing, it's enough. And we always joke about that. Yeah, every synagogue should be so fortunate to be able to say that to its members or people who would like to donate. Stop bringing, you got more money than we need to run the shul. But how do you get people to understand that spirit about wanting to donate, wanting to bring things? I agree with you, David. It's not through making them feel, as much as this is part of the tradition and we joke about it, it's not about making them feel guilty or implications for not doing so. It's about showing them the value of supporting something that can be meaningful for them, and if not personally for them, meaningful for others, and that should be as much of a consideration of theirs when deciding to contribute, whether it be their time or their resources.
Well, that reminds me of just learning about the truma. The word truma is contribution, but it also has the same root as laharim, to raise. So the whole notion of giving raises your spirit, raises who you are. I just seem to remember that.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love that. Okay, anyone else have a question or thought they'd like to share? Well, if not, I thank you all for coming together today. We come from separateness before, but hopefully we continue to come together and find common purpose and study and exploration of things that we may have considered, but see the benefit of considering it together as part of the relationship of study together. So hope you all have a wonderful day and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.